So this segment is going to be about the specifics of designing surveys for research purposes. So why would you use a survey? It's actually quite common to use a survey. It's one way to measure human experience. And by that I just mean that when you're conducting surveys, you're going to be asking people about their experiences, their impressions, their perceptions, their opinions. And so it's just one way to sort of capture what one person experiences as real for him or herself. There are, of course, some limitations to survey research. For example, you don't always measure the truth. You just really are measuring one person's perception of the truth. You're measuring one person's experience, and that doesn't necessarily capture what's reality for many people. And you certainly cannot measure causation from a survey alone. So if you want to know what causes violence, a survey is probably only going to measure an individual's perception of what causes violence. And that, of course, assumes that you're going to conduct survey questions asking people about this particular topic. What you're going to learn is what people think about it, but that may not be the reality. Regardless, though, survey research is attractive and popular for many reasons. It's very versatile. It's certainly efficient, especially this day and age. You don't even have to see a person face-to-face to conduct a survey. You can email out 1,000 surveys in a couple of seconds, and they can be generalizable to the greater population if sampling has done well. So let's just talk about some rules for writing questions, and then we'll look at some questions and see if we can critique them. So first of all, you want to avoid being vague. You never want to have to explain a question that is unclear to someone. Be as clear as possible, and we'll, as I said, go through some examples together, and maybe we'll see a few that are just vaguely written. It's the type of question that may lead a participant in your study to say, I'm not sure exactly what you mean by that. You also want to avoid negatives and double negatives, and I think that, again, we'll see some examples of that. Maybe you've heard of a double-barreled question. A double-barreled question is one where really you're asking two questions at one time, and it's best to avoid that because they are unclear, and sometimes you're not sure if you answer yes or no, which piece of that question you're answering yes or no to. And so it's best to separate those questions into two separate and distinct ones rather than combining it into one. An example of a double-barreled question might be something like, do you go to the movies and do you like to get popcorn? And the answers are either yes or no. Well, maybe you would answer, yes, I like to go to the movies, but no, I don't like to get popcorn. And a double-barreled question doesn't allow you to make that distinction. You also want to avoid leading questions. Things like, don't you like going to the movies? If you ask, don't you like going to the movies, you're really pointing the person to the answer that you think they should answer. And you want to avoid that if you want to do research well. You might also want to consider the order of your questions. Think, for example, about how you may be implying something or sending a message you don't intend to send by linking some questions together. So, for example, I'm trying to pull from even my own experience. I worked with women in the Hospital University of Pennsylvania who were involved with intimate partner violence, and we conducted surveys with those women, and we did have to really carefully consider the order of our questions. For example, we wanted to ask women about their past experiences with maybe childhood trauma, childhood sexual abuse, but we knew that couldn't be the first question we asked them. We knew that was the kind of thing you had to warm up to. You had to get to know somebody a little bit first. You had to break the ice with maybe some easier questions to answer rather than things that are so tough so quickly. You also want to be careful about linking things together. So although we were curious about times where maybe the women that we were speaking to were also perpetrators of violence, we didn't want to send the message that, for example, when you were the victim of violence, it was your fault or that you asked for it in some way. So we had to carefully separate out the questions that could seem potentially victim blaming if they were in the wrong order. We had to make sure that it was clear what we were asking about were separate experiences from the times that you'd been victimized, and not send the message that, you brought this on by your own behavior. So you do have to be very gentle and sensitive with the order of your questions. Of course, this is probably self-explanatory, but you certainly want to edit your questions for spelling errors, and it's always a good idea to pilot your questions with people who can give you some feedback on how well they were written. So before you actually begin conducting your study, try them out on some other folks who are not a part of your study, for whom, the responses will not be collected or recorded in any way, and ask them, are these questions clear? Are any of them leading? Does anything maybe need to be reordered in a way that would make you more comfortable? So it's just good practice to be in. The most important rule, though, is that you have to keep in mind what you will be using this information for, and design your questions in a way that sets you up well. So, for example, if you want to be calculating correlation, you have to ask questions that will allow you to do that. If you ask open-ended questions that allow people to give full sentence responses rather than closed questions or those that allow you to give a numeric answer, I don't know how you'll be calculating really any statistics. And so you have to design your questions to set you up well for the statistical analysis you'd like to do in the future. And so know before you begin your survey, do I want to be working with nominal data, ordinal data, interval data, ratio data? Do I want to run basic descriptive statistics, or do I want to gather inferential statistics? If you're only going to be asking about simple frequencies and counts of things that have happened, just know that that's the data you'll have to work with. If you're going to be asking all yes and no questions, just know that at the end, when you collect all that together, you have a bunch of yes/no responses. And think about how versatile that information will be for you, and how limited you will be in how much you can analyze statistically. So let's look at some examples. This question says, do you like apples for breakfast, or do you usually skip breakfast? And the choices are, I like apples for breakfast, or I usually skip breakfast. And the problem here is this is a double-barreled question. It's asking two questions at once. Do you like apples for breakfast should be its own question, or do you skip breakfast should be a separate question. Here, a person might say, I skip breakfast, but I also like apples, or I eat breakfast, but I don't like apples for breakfast. And so a person could have a really difficult time answering this question. This is where you would want to separate them out rather than having the double-barreled question. This one says, how many apples do you eat each day? And your choices are 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now, what do you see as maybe a critique of this question? Pause for a second and consider how this might be better worded, or how options could be offered in a better way. One of the problems here is that this question assumes everyone eats apples. There's no option to say 0. Another problem here is there's no option to say greater than 4. You're limited to 1, 2, 3, or 4. This question asks, what is your favorite kind of apple? And it gives 4 choices: Red Delicious, Gala, Fuji, and Granny Smith. What do you think is maybe a critique of this question? How could this one be improved? Well, this one does not offer a full range of options. This is another thing that you want to be really careful about in designing survey questions, that you capture the full range of possible experiences. Now, I'll be honest, I don't even know how many types of apples are out there, so maybe it's so many that we couldn't really list them all on this survey. But at a minimum, you could potentially have these 4 options plus one that says other with a blank to fill in what is a person's favorite kind of apple. But in this case, if your favorite kind of apple is Macintosh, you're not going to know how to answer this question. You may just pick your second favorite kind of apple. Fine, that gets you through answering the survey as the survey taker. But as the survey collector, you now have false information. You've now got a response that says, my favorite kind of apple is Red Delicious, when really that's not true. The truth is this person's favorite kind of apple is Macintosh. Now you have misleading information, and you don't even know that you have misleading information. And then just a note here, what level of measurement is this? It would be nominal. These categories have names, and there's not much you can do statistically with that information. This question asks, how often do you like to eat apples? And it offers a blank space to fill in your own response for how often you like to eat apples. The problem here is that people will not know what level of measurement to provide. Think of so many ways a person could answer this question. My goodness, a person could just write often, right? The question is, how often do you like to eat apples? Often. Somebody could just say a lot. Somebody could write the word hardly ever, or phrase hardly ever. A person could write the number 5, but you wouldn't know what that 5 even means. Is that 5 times a month? 5 times a week? Is that 5 apples a day? 5 is pretty meaningless without any more information. And so how often do you like to eat apples with just this open blank space doesn't help you as the researcher, because you'll end up with responses all over the place that many of them you'll have to just throw out. And that's really common in research as well, where they take what they call bad data, data that we can't make sense of, and we have to just trash it. Well, you can help that. You can save yourself that trouble by just asking a very clear question with clear responses. In fact, you could just leave this blank here, but ask the question in a different way. How often do you like to eat apples could be changed to how many times a week do you eat an apple, with a blank. And especially if you're using an electronic survey, it's easy enough to require that whatever goes in that blank be a numeric entry. So the person has to write a number, and that number should be representing number of times per week. Or be clear if you mean how many apples in a week versus how many times eating apples in a week. Those are two very different things that you'll have to be clear about. Another question you could ask is, how do you like to eat apples? Think about what might be limiting about this question and how you could improve it. How do you like to eat apples? Well, there might not be anything technically wrong with this question, but I hope you're prepared to collect and analyze qualitative data, because the question, how do you like to eat apples, is not going to result in a numeric response. It will probably result in a sentence or 2 or 3, some sort of description of how a person likes to eat apples. And keep in mind, this is vague. Somebody could say with peanut butter. Somebody could say chopped up. Somebody could say peeled. Somebody could say in pie. Somebody could say standing up. I like to eat apples standing up. There are so many ways to interpret even just that word how. And so again, you may want to help yourself along by either clearing up exactly what you mean by how, like how do you like them prepared, something like that. Or if you are not inclined to analyze qualitative data, then you may want to provide responses that a person can choose from in a multiple choice sort of way. This question asks, don't you think Red Delicious apples are better than boring oranges? Don't you think Red Delicious apples are better than boring oranges? What do you think might be troubling about this question? Well, it's leading. It's telling the person what you think they should answer. They should be choosing apples over oranges, and you're just sort of checking with them. And this is an uncomfortable place as a respondent, because maybe you really like oranges, but you're sort of being nudged toward this other answer. So this question would be leading.